Hey everybody, welcome back to Saturdays with Paul. So this is the second video in the Satoh S650G rebuild series. Last video I kind of gave an intro, went over the basic issues that I discovered when I first bought the tractor, how I acquired it, why, and all that fun stuff. So this video we're going to start getting into more of the issues that came up and what I had to do to fix it. So we're going to start off here with this shot which I included in the last video of the rear end of the tractor. This is at the Pto Shaft, and as you can see it looks horrible, right? You know, it's got this really thick buildup of grime and grease and oil and everything on it. There's a leak in the Pto Shaft seal. The fluid coming out of it is the transmission oil that's been mixed up with water because of the issue with the shifter boot being degraded and allowing water to get down inside the transmission. So this was one of the first big things I decided to work on because I'd already gotten it running, driven it down into the driveway, so I wasn't worried about that part. Now it was time to start dealing with everything else on it. So this here is a shot after I cleaned, scraped off, wire brushed, sprayed, scrubbed. Lots of elbow grease and effort went into this, and as you can tell, it's much cleaner. There's details here you probably had no idea were even there in that last photo. You'll notice not only do we have this leak here from this PTO seal, but we also have the problem where there's supposed to be a shroud for the PTO shaft, a safety shroud, to help keep you from accidentally getting your hand caught if you're leaning back over the tractor or doing something while it's running. But that shield is entirely gone. All that's left is the mounting plate that's bolted on there with those 4 nuts you can see around the PTO shaft. Then below that is the drawbar. That nothing really of note there. It is missing a piece. That's why there's 2 extra bolt holes in that center down there. There's supposed to be a stabilizer bar that's supposed to bolt onto that, so when you put your pin in, it doesn't want to rock back and forth. And you'll notice underneath I've got a pan there, and let's take a look at the contents of that a little more closely here. Okay, so here's a good shot of what came out of the transmission. That is definitely not what gear oil should look like. This has gotten quite a bit of water into it and has been just mixed up, and there's no salvaging it without a lot of effort. One thing to keep in mind is when you've got oils that end up like this, where they've got water contamination, you know, there's a lot of places you can take your old fluids to, like, you know, Auto Parts Store, AutoZone, O'Reilly, that kind of stuff, where they'll take your old used motor oil and gear oil and transmission oil and send it off to be recycled. However, if it's got water contamination like this in it, they do not want to accept it, because if this gets in with a batch, it basically has contaminated the entire batch, and there's extra steps that have to be done in order to salvage and recycle this fluid. It's a more involved process, and it's a more expensive process, so they definitely want to avoid that as much as possible. So if you run into an issue like this, usually your local landfill will accept this type of material, and you can take it there, and generally it's free for you to drop it off, which was good for me because this was about, well, combined with the water in there, it was about six gallons or so of transmission oil that I needed to dispose of. Okay, so here is a shot of inside the transmission after I drained it out. This is the gear selector. Up here at the top, you can see it was starting to rust because of the water that was coming in. You know, that was the first spot that was getting hit with water, and one of the least lubricated portions in here, so it was starting to rust. Fortunately, nothing really bad, just some surface rust. A little bit of work with a wire brush cleaned that up quite nicely. If you look down in the gearbox here, you can see all the gears for the transmission, and you can see the remaining fluid that's still clinging to the gears. So this was before I got everything really cleaned out. So I had to go through and make sure I got rid of as much of this old contaminated fluid as possible. Otherwise, it will continue to cause problems, though definitely not to the extent as having the entire gearbox filled with that consistency. Okay, and here's a little bit closer shot I took, just kind of inspecting. You can see that some of these gears were starting to unfortunately suffer from rust damage on the face of the teeth. There's really nothing I can do about that, unfortunately, except hope it doesn't, hopefully by putting fresh fluid in and keeping an eye on everything, it won't chew itself up quickly, and I can get a good amount of use out of the tractor. But it is unfortunate that this did start to occur. That indicates that this had been like this for a while, to get all these little pits of rust in there. I don't know if you can really see it. It's kind of hard to see unless you have a large screen or really high definition. But trust me, there's little tiny specks of rust all over the face of these gear teeth. And then here's one last shot, kind of looking down the side. I was inspecting, some of these rods and more of the gears. And fortunately, the rods all looked really good. Overall, everything was really in quite nice of shape in here. It was really just the surface rust on the face, the teeth of the gears that was unfortunate to find, but there's not much I can do about that. It's not like I can go get new gears for this. I would have to basically go find a donor tractor, and I don't know that it's worth it because nothing's broken. It's going to start wearing out a little quicker than one would like. Okay, so moving on, the next issue I noticed was for the front end loader. The blue part is one of the brackets for the front end loader, and you can see here this bolt on the right, it's loose. And I tried to tighten it up, but it was just not happening. I wasn't sure if it had never been tight or if it had just worked itself loose or what the problem was, but it was not going back in. So this was going to be something I was going to have to deal with at a later time. Here's another shot of some more of these bolts. This one you can see right in the center of the screen there, completely loose. It's not holding anything. With stuff like this, it's always a good idea especially when you have a heavy equipment like a tractor or excavator or anything like that, that periodically you go through and just confirm that everything is tight. Once bolts start loosening up, things start moving around in ways they shouldn't, and that's how you end up damaging your equipment, and it can end up costing you a lot more in the long run than the 5 minutes, even like once a week. Just every week, just go through it 5 minutes, make sure everything looks tight. One thing I like to do, especially on vehicles, when I work on my vehicles, is as I work on stuff and tighten it back up, if I've had to unbolt it, I will put some paint marker, just a line on it, so I can quickly get a visual confirmation if that bolt head has unscrewed at all or not. If the lines are all still in the same place, then everything's fine, but it would be pretty obvious if the bolt is turned because the line painted onto the bolt will be offset from the line painted on the surface that it's clamping onto. And this is the other side. You can't tell as easily. That right hand bolt is nice and tight. The left hand one was starting to loosen up as well. This is just another shot of that, kind of getting all 4 of the upper bolts. There's 2 more underneath. Those ones were fortunately tight, I believe, but I've since gone through and taken care of all this, fortunately, as part of this whole rebuild process. Okay, so moving on, the next issue was the alternator. I was having a problem with it not charging correctly. I think in the last video I said it wasn't charging at all. That was actually an incorrect statement. from what I recall, it was actually overcharging. The voltage coming out of the alternator was too high. If you have too high a voltage, it can actually damage components because they're not designed to be run over a certain voltage. It will also overcharge your battery and can cause problems with the batteries. When you run too high a voltage into a battery while charging it, it'll actually cause the electrolyte in it to start to bubble and create gas, which the gas can build up. It can build up pressure. I've seen recently pictures of people who had that type of problem, and the battery started to overpressurize, and then it starts to leak, and the gas that it creates is actually explosive, and just a little tiny spark is all it takes, and it'll actually get down into the battery, and the whole battery will explode and blow apart. And then you've got acid solution sprayed all over the place, which not only will hurt you between the acid and the potential impact trauma from the shrapnel from the battery, but also once that acid mixture starts getting onto your equipment, it will start to eat away and cause rust and other issues, and you have to go in and clean it up very, very thoroughly, because it will just get into every little crevice it can find. You want to rinse it off with a solution of water and baking soda to neutralize the acid, and then wash it all off as much as possible. And just, wash it, wash it. And if you think you've got it all clean, wash it some more, because I guarantee there'll still be some there. So going back to this, obviously this connector is in pretty rough shape. I ended up replacing one of the terminals on it because if I remember correctly, this one was just no good. I can't remember if it was broken or what, but I had to trim it back a little bit, put a new connector on there, and I was going to heat shrink that on. And then you can see the connector housing is just breaking away. What I actually ended up doing is I just removed the whole connector. I was able to finally find a kit that had this style of connector included in it. I couldn't get it by itself, so I ended up buying this whole set. Because this isn't a super common connector, but it's common enough that you can buy kits on Amazon and eBay and such that include these types of connectors for it. So I was able to replace that with one that actually was in good shape, and then continue on with trying to repair it. And like I mentioned in the last video, I did end up replacing the voltage regulator as well. It was an old mechanical one. I replaced it with a new electric one. And you can see here's the new plug in the alternator, having replaced the old one. So all new contacts, new housing, everything looks great and much better shape than it was in before. Okay, so onto the throttle cable. I mentioned in the last video that the throttle cable had broken off from the eyelet up by the throttle lever on the dash. And you can see here, this is what was left. There's the eyelet. The original one is that smaller one lower down with the bit of cable still crimped into it, but it broken off. So the easiest thing I could figure was to just custom make my own replacement. So I took some steel rod and heated it up with a MAP torch, kind of like a propane torch, but burns at a much hotter temperature, and heated that up and flattened it out, and then drilled a hole on the flattened end to go on the pin on the throttle lever, and then on the end I drew a center hole for the cable to go into, so that I could then crimp that down and fashion a new end for it. I ended up originally making it a little too long, which was okay. It's always easier to remove material than it is to add it. So I determined what I had made was too long and just cut it and chamfered the end there for that inlet hole. And then I was able to heat it up and just used a hammer and smashed it down onto the cable, and it's not going anywhere now. So that was a good easy fix. Kind of fun too, getting to expand my skills there. So here's the shot of the boot that I used to replace the old one on the shifter. Again, this was a universal ATV, so four-wheeler CV axle boot, and it had a couple different sizes for it, and so I just cut off the bigger one and used the inner one and just slipped it over, zip tied it in place, used that clamp and got it on there, and then finished off the shifter with a, a little purple swirl pool ball style shifter knob, since the original one was missing, and I figured why not. It was actually cheaper to get this little ball off somebody on eBay, I think it was, and rather than trying to find a original style shifter, it adds a little personal touch, a little bit of fun to it, so why not. Okay, so in the last video, one of the things I showed was the front end loader bucket. If you haven't watched the video, I recommend you go back and start there. It gives a lot of the foundation for where this tractor was at when I first bought it. For those of you who did watch it, you probably remember the right hand side on the screen here. That side of the bucket was completely bent in. I think it must have gotten run into by something else, because I can't imagine he swung that bucket to the side hard enough to be able to do that amount of damage. What I ended up doing here was just kind of bracing up both sides, and I used a farm jack, high lift jack, to spread it back out, and got it pretty straight. It's not perfect, but it's good enough. So that was good to get that taken care of, and it helped remove some of the bow that was in the bottom lip of the bucket. Okay, well, this is the last thing I'm going to go over on this video. So this is a attempt, and I use that loosely, to fix the issue with the steering arm being loose on the kingpin splines. The kingpin itself had suffered no damage, fortunately. It's good hard steel. However, that arm is just cast steel, cast iron, so it's much softer, which is kind of good, but not at the same time. So this is how much of a gap there was between the arm and the splines of the shaft. I tried using some thin steel to kind of shim it up and fill it in, but the problem was it was just so oddly worn that you couldn't do something like this and really have it end up getting fixed. So I ended up coming up with a couple other ideas, one of which I've tried and is my current fix that's in place. And I'll be going over that in one of the future videos. But I did try this, and it kind of helped. But the reality is, it was just not going to work. It was not a long-term fix at all. So that kind of gets us caught up to that point with the progress of this tractor. Obviously there's all these little things that kind of add up and end up taking up a lot of time when trying to do a rebuild and a restoration on something like this. My thing is, whenever I do a project like this, I don't do it halfway, as much as possible. Sometimes I'll get a little, I'm tired working on this, I just want to get it fixed and move on. But most of the time, I do try to spend time doing stuff as well as I can, so that I can have a nice long-term solution for whatever problem I'm dealing with, rather than having to keep going back and revisiting it and making future fixes and taking up more time and more money. It's always best to try and do it right the first time. So that's where we're at for this point, and I will be putting together some more of these videos for you guys. I apologize for the format. I know basically watching a slideshow isn't the most interesting thing in the world, but this is what I've got, and just wanted to kind of give a foundation of the story of this tractor and share this story with you and some of the things I've done. I promise in future videos moving forward, once we get through all these this historical stuff, I'll be doing actual live footage and actual recordings. So We'll get to that point soon here. Well, I hope you enjoyed this, and thank you for watching. If you like this, please hit the like button down below. If you have any questions or comments, post them, and I will try to answer them. If you haven't already, it'd be great if you'd subscribe and then click the bell so you can get notified as I upload more of this content. Thanks again for watching, and we'll talk to you later.